you very much and welcome you. I don't want to waste much time, and I would like to ask Alex Gladstein from the Oslo Freedom Forum to come and say a few words.
Thank you all very much. We're very grateful that you came today. It's a very important program, Media Under Fire. I wanted to do two quick things. One, express gratitude to the Nelson Mandela Foundation and Cello for hosting us. And two, tell you a little bit why we bring together people like at least the three speakers who are on the panel who come from our community together each year in Norway and now here in Johannesburg. We have Iyad al-Baghdadi, who is a very prominent social media figure in the Arab world, who expressed his opinions when the Arab Spring began and expressed a very consistent anti-authoritarianism and criticized dictatorships across the Arab world. And for his criticism and his outspoken nature, he was jailed, put in a dungeon, and deported from his country, the United Arab Emirates. Zeynep El Razoui is a Moroccan-born French journalist who was expressing herself creatively in Morocco, both with street protests and later as a journalist, and was jailed many times in Morocco, and eventually left the country, and now speaks up for free expression in France, but mainly, for a more global audience. And finally, Rafael Marques de Moraes is an Angolan journalist who's actually on trial right now in Angola. He miraculously was allowed to come here, but he's been exposing corruption for 2 decades. So all three of them are excellent people to talk about what it means to consider media under fire. They're all storytellers who are trying to speak truth to power. And I think all of the speakers at the Oslo Freedom Forum, no matter what profession they are, in that way they all tell the stories that no one wants to hear or that people in power don't want to hear. And we have an obligation to both support them with solidarity, with resources, with attention, with new tools, with skills. And we also have, we think, an obligation and a duty to celebrate them because they do things that a lot of people choose not to do or are afraid to do. And they really are heroes for our time. So with that, I'm going to thank you all from the Human Rights Foundation, and we're looking forward to the panel.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to now ask William Bird, one of our partners. Every time there's any need for media, thank you very much for always thinking that we are a worthy partner. William?
Right, good morning. It's good to be speaking at a podium with a working mic. It's an in-joke. Last time we were here, we broke it, so... Thank you so much to the Foundation and friends, and to Cello, and to hopefully our new emerging friends, the OFF and Human Rights Foundation. It's really cool to partner on an event like this, especially when you've got such a brilliant diversity of speakers. I'm thrilled by the South African contingent, and obviously we're biased towards them because we think they're marvelous. You'll see Khadija and Krivani shortly, those of you who don't know them. Khadija is obviously the editor of the Mail and Guardian, and Krivani is a pretty famous person from the SABC, and I'm sure she'll get into some of the details. So I'm the director of Media Monitoring Africa. This year we're celebrating 25 years of Media Monitoring Africa's existence. So we're an NGO that's been around a long time, enough to almost call us institutionalized. Many of our people probably should be institutionalized. That's because they've had to work with me for a long time. I'm sorry about that too, but we do have lovely colleagues. So I wanted to just start to frame the debate a little bit by talking about what we're hoping to achieve. So we've moved from a time, certainly in South Africa, where we've known the enemy. It used to be the state, right? It was big, it was bad, it was there. And now we have a multitude of enemies, not only in South Africa, but around the world. And power is exercised in a variety of ways. The internet is one of the key elements that's helped to shift this. But it also seems that many of the dark forces have been among the fastest to realize the real power of the internet and to use it to their own ends and purposes. They've been a lot faster than many in our journalism sector, in fact. So we also see our media in a state of fluidity. We've got fewer journalists, downsized newsrooms, business models that, broadly speaking, are failing, especially on our continent. And we've also seen this explosion of digital, albeit an unequal and divided one, playing out through our digital divide. So it's not as though these things are equitable, but you can't deny that that move is occurring. So it is a great irony that, in fact, at the time of the greatest access to information in our history, and with access to the internet being recognized as a human right, where anyone with access to a phone can do just about anything, and it's at that moment so ironic that the critical importance of journalism is so completely profound. So we see that this access to the internet has amazing possibilities to spread and disseminate information, but it's also brought with it misinformation, abuse, new forms of gender violence. We have a weaponized social media, and all of this comes with the same benefits of ease available to the dark forces. So in as much as it's easy for any one of us in the room to do something, hopefully for good, it's equally easy. In fact, it's a lot easier because they've got seemingly unending resources for the dark forces to use it for their own nefarious purposes. So those who seek to undermine our democracies are able to do it in a way that are far more sophisticated. And we also know that the state is no longer the core seat of power. We've got behemoth multinational corporations, not just the likes of the social media ones who some of you may think of, but those that seek to shift and shape our narratives in their favor. And critically, for them to suppress, undermine, or disinform those who seek to expose wrongdoing. With a decrease in number of journalists, we've also witnessed an explosion of PR. So there's no surprise that those things have pretty much exploded. We're seeing issues of journalism, etc. So while broadly speaking in South Africa, unless you're trying to interview the EFF, journalists can say and write what they want. The EFF, or our international guest, is one of our big political parties who seem to have a rather violent response to journalists asking them questions. It doesn't mean that the threats aren't there, but they're coming from different places and different sectors in our country. So it's when our media are at their greatest threat, in physical forms, in business terms, that they are needed the most. So the question arises as to why. Why do some of these extraordinary people who are with us today do what they do? For me, it's one of those deep questions, and I'm not sure we'll get to answer that. But we need to ask, are they simply daredevils or who don't care very much about their own life or that of their families in some instances? Or do they just have some other kind of inbuilt sense of justice? Why do they choose this path of greatest resistance when a lesser path to self-censor may seem more obvious? So the second issue is around self-censorship, which is obviously the easy way out. And the sad reality is I suspect that the majority of people in the media sector choose this path, right? It is the path of least resistance. Why would you put your livelihood or your life at risk when you simply have to self-censor and it might be okay? Yet they choose to take a very different position, to speak out. So we're going to hear from some extraordinary people, and we're going to tease out issues of self-censorship, of courage, of why they do what they do, but also how they deal with the threats, where they see them coming from, and how they deal with them. They have incredible experiences from different countries, and I'm hoping that we can learn from them and see what resonates for us in our own experiences, in our own lives. I'm looking forward to a great debate. Thanks. Discussion.
Thank you very much. I think, again, without much further ado, we've missed a bit of time already. Chris Vick will be facilitating. He'll then introduce his panel, and we can kick off. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Comrade Silo. My name is Chris Vick. I'm a spin doctor. I think it's very, very ironic that you've invited me to facilitate a conversation about threats to the media, because apparently I'm one of them. Khadija has a predecessor named Nick Dawes, who, apart from describing me as one of the best spin doctors in South Africa, said, I make a living packaging shit must as bonbons. So I spend a lot of time trying to outwit journalists and trying to convince them that they are wrong and my clients are right. And I find that very ironic, but thank you for the opportunity to build my client base and talk about what I do. I want to take a very hands-off approach to the conversation. I really want to let the panelists speak today. So the way it's structured is we've got about an hour for them to speak about their own experiences, and then probably less than an hour now for you to ask questions of them. And we had a discussion at the back about how to do that. And I think we've agreed that we're not going to try and force the situation in Morocco or any other country, Angola, into the South African context. It's very different. The lived experience of our international guests is very different from our lived experience as South Africans. And I think you're smart enough to come to your own conclusions and make up your own minds about what we can learn from their experience, and listen to our South African colleagues about what we can also learn from their experience. So that's my suggestion. I hope you're happy with it. A free-flowing conversation wherever possible, but we're talking about serious issues. I'm a former journalist. I survived apartheid. I worked on a newspaper called City Press, where our offices were raided by the security police. My colleagues were locked up. Newspapers were banned. We've survived that era, but there are still dangers out there, as William says, which are very, very important to our democracy. And I think you'll agree that the more the political temperature rises in South Africa, the more the temperature within the media environment rises. We're approaching an election next year. We're just out of something that's bravely called the New Dawn, which isn't, I don't think the sun has quite come up yet on that New Dawn. But the political temperature in South Africa, I believe, is only going to increase in the next year. And our journalistic friends are going to be under threat. Civil society activists are going to be under threat. So it's a very important time to have this conversation.
I'm currently the executive producer of SAFM Current Affairs. That's one of the units within the SABC News division. In 2016, and possibly the reason why I'm here in the first place, is that I was thrust together with 7 other colleagues, and we became the so-called SABC 8, who spoke out against editorial interference, which eventually led to the first ever parliamentary inquiry into the SABC, and eventually to the subsequent ousting, together with legal battles, of the former COO, Hlaudi Motsoeneng. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Khadija Patel. Yes, I'm one of the journalists that were late. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian. And to answer Chris, I think what I'm really passionate about at this moment is to find ways to ensure that independent media thrive. It's more difficult than than you actually think.
Well, good morning. My name is Iyad Al-Baghdadi. I would describe myself as a writer, but I had a previous career as a startup consultant in the United Arab Emirates. I became an activist upon the start of the Arab uprisings in 2011. Quickly became an influential social media figure. And eventually I was jailed and expelled from the country against the backgrounds of pro-democracy activism. So now I live in exile in Norway, Oslo, Norway, not a bad place to be in exile in. And I moved from the country with one of the worst records in press freedom to the country that tops the world in press freedom. But social media has allowed me not only to continue to study authoritarian behavior and their spin, but also to continue to be a part of the struggle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zineb El Ghazouiya. I would like to say thank you to everyone to host this panel. I am a French and Moroccan journalist and writer. And I will briefly try during that panel to tell you about my story. I started journalism in 2007 in Morocco in a newspaper that was shut off by the regime. And then I traveled to France, where I thought I will find more freedom of speech, but it ended up by killing my colleagues in Charlie Hebdo in 2012. And I will also speak about my experience as social media activist at the time in Morocco, and how also I was arrested because of that.
I'm Rafael Marques. I'm an Angolan journalist. What I do most is investigate corruption and dig human rights abuses and expose them. And for that, I'm glad to be on trial all the time and have problems with the authorities. Thanks.
Thanks, Rafael. Zineb, I want to start with you. The attack on Charlie Hebdo, you weren't physically there when it happened. But some of what I've read suggests that you were supposed to be there, or the people who attacked thought you were going to be there. How do you feel when you sit down and write now? Is Charlie Hebdo and the murder of your colleagues always in your mind? And do you feel that in a way you're censoring anything about your thought processes or what you're writing?
I was supposed to be there that day. I was working, I was not on holiday. And I woke up very early that day. I was in Casablanca in Morocco. And the day before I was saying, shall I jump in a plane and just go? But finally I felt lazy. And I woke up early that day. I sent my article project to Stéphane Charbonnier, Charb, our director who was killed. And I was expecting his answer after the meeting of the editorial board. But instead of that, I got a phone call telling me that there is fire shootings in Charlie Hebdo. And at the beginning, I thought it was like, it was nothing important. A mad guy came. You know, we were used to that in Charlie Hebdo. A mad guy came and he shot and he broke 2 windows. But actually, when I called, a colleague told me there is at least 10 people killed and Charb was killed. I couldn't. I mean, I went there the day after, and immediately after the terrorist attacks, no one wanted to quit Charlie Hebdo. No one wanted to change any single word in the editorial line. But we didn't know at that time that what will really change things in Charlie Hebdo will be the fact that we were maybe the poorest newspaper in France before the terrorist attacks, and we received a lot of money. And this deeply changes a newspaper. And so, yeah, I may speak about that later, but most of us, most of the survivors left Charlie Hebdo because of money issues, shareholding issues, and yeah, this really kills the soul of a newspaper. And at the beginning, I couldn't feel as a survivor, because I was not there. I was not even injured. Till I met another journalist, an Algerian journalist who is French and Algerian, Mohamed Sifawi, and he told me that one day he was an editor-in-chief in Algeria, and he left his office just to go and buy cigarettes at 3 o'clock, and at 3:05, a car full with the bombs came, and 60 of his colleagues were killed in Algeria. So that's how he ended up exiled in France. And he also told me I couldn't feel as a survivor because I wasn't there. And yeah, it's I still think about that every day, and it definitely gives me another way to consider our profession as journalists. Actually, it can kill. It's not just a theory, it's a reality. Being a journalist is literally risking one's life.
Has it changed the way that you approach journalism? I mean, you're obviously an activist and a journalist. Do you find that you write differently, that you cover different issues than you covered before?
Actually, in my very specific case, my main problem in doing my job as a journalist is the fact that I'm under police protection. And my job at Charlie Hebdo was, I was a reporter. I used to travel to meet different communities. either travel abroad or also in the city, in Paris or in the suburbs. It's very difficult to do that when you are surrounded by bodyguards who are policemen, which is a very strange situation for me because usually policemen and journalists don't like each other. And and we were, after the terrorist attacks, we had a lot of policemen in Libération, and so we were like observing, you had two groups of people observing each other, but we learned that they have some nice guys with them, and they also started to look at us as people who might be good. We are not only the cliche of the journalist, you know, who is betraying the secret, who is selling his mother for a scoop, you know. So now I try to do my job differently, but I definitely don't renounce any single line, any single value of what I see as my own way to do journalism. I learned journalism in Morocco, and it was in Morocco, because you want to do your job simply as a journalist, you become a fighter, you become an opponent, and you become someone who is literally harassed by the regime. I started in 2007 in Morocco in a newspaper that doesn't exist anymore now, a weekly magazine. It was shut off by the regime in January 2010. And being a journalist in Morocco at the time meant necessarily to be a fighter, to be someone who speaks about human rights and who crosses what was called the red lines at the time in Morocco: the monarchy, the Western Sahara, and Islam. And so when you are an outspoken, a courageous journalist in Morocco, you're supposed to speak about that, which is just the same in France. Now there is clearly one more red line in the freedom of speech in France. It's the fact of speaking about Islam.
We're going to come back to some of your points during the question, but thank you for that. I know it must be quite painful to talk about what you went through, and I really appreciate your honesty. Thank you for that. You know, I want to come to you. I mean, my understanding is that you played a very important role during the Arab Spring in helping the message reach the rest of the world. That in a sense, you were a kind of a conduit. You were translating Arabic message, you were translating the struggle of people involved in the Arab Spring to people in other parts of the world. How difficult was that? Did you filter? Did you amend? Did you change what you were communicating?
Well, I'll start with a little correction. And this is the activist in me, but I think it's also a moral responsibility. I did not play a big role. Hundreds of young people died. They put their life on the line. They went and faced security guards, security police. I was tweeting from an apartment in the United Arab Emirates. Of course, I had no access. I didn't live. I grew up stateless. I'm a Palestinian by ethnicity, but I lived my entire life in the United Arab Emirates. And that's a country that does not give citizenship rights, no matter how long you live there. So I had a refugees travel document which restricted my freedom of travel. As a result, I was not able to be there for any of those protests. I lived away from the heartlands of the revolutions. And I keep telling myself that had I been there, it would have been different, and my life would have taken a very different, route. But I felt a moral responsibility that the least I can do is spread the message. And thankfully, I had, I found the right platform, because keep in mind that you're living in a country that does not have any freedom of expression. So there's no free press. There is no space for you in official media. You can't write books. You can't become a journalist, because journalism there is basically just repeating government propaganda in some way or the other. You can't join academia. Even the academic space is very restricted. You cannot start an NGO. So the only space we had was social media. And we really dove into that space. We used every bit of space that was available to us. So initially, in the initial phases, which I'm talking post January 25th, or let's say specifically post January 21st, after the ousting of Ben Ali in Tunisia, it was such a shock to our collective consciousness that, wow, this is possible. And we felt, we really threw caution to the wind. I felt the least I can do. If my sisters and brothers in Egypt and in Syria and in Yemen are putting their lives on the line, can I really say, oh, I shouldn't tweet that? I mean, I couldn't live with myself. So I really dove in. I mean, I at the time I was a startup consultant. I completely ignored my clients, and I did the honorable thing by, I actually lived for 4 months on a sofa bed opposite my laptop. And when those 4 months were over, like maybe around May 2011, that's when things had changed a little bit. We were in the middle of a civil war in Libya, and then the starting of something similar in Syria. I almost could not remember what I was doing before. And there is this intergenerational aspect to this, because I remember a conversation with my father where I'm telling him this has completely changed my life, and he's still wondering why it happened.
But I mean, two things. One, it's a huge responsibility in a way to take on, because you're articulating the views of communities and activists that you'd never met, presumably. They would have expectations of you because you were, in a way, assisting their struggles. And the international community would have an expectation in terms of what they were doing and how the messages were being received. How did you deal with that? Because it sounds like a very lonely existence on your couch with your laptop, and yet there are revolutions taking place all around you. How did you deal with that?
Well, first of all, initially I didn't have a big account. I mean, when the Egyptian revolution started, January 25th, 2011, I had maybe 100 followers. So what I did at the time is that I started translating video messages, and I said, listen, all I should do is simply translate these messages, because this is not the time for me to add anything of my own. I had opinions, but I thought it's not really valid for me to even add anything. So what I did is that I started to communicate with people who have big accounts, and I said, listen, check this out. I'm translating this. Can you push it? And with each video that went viral, the number of my followers increased, and that's when it becomes, if it's an account that has 100 or 200 followers tweeting stuff, journalists don't really contact you, and they don't really, they're just interested in maybe the video. Once you hit the threshold of maybe 5,000 followers or something like that, that's when they start looking into you. They want to know who you are. So on the one hand, you're right, there was a bit, especially with Libya, for example. In Libya, and if you remember the timeline, I mean, I remember the timeline because I lived it really hour by hour. But at some point, Tripoli went dark. The internet basically went out in Tripoli. This was like around, if I remember correctly, this was like between February 25th and March 3rd. And I managed to get in touch with a lady who has a satellite internet connection in Tripoli. And that was the only internet connection, as far as I know, in Tripoli. And it was an older British Libyan woman. She's British, but she was married to a Libyan for 22 years. And she was sending me these videos, and she's like, you're the only one who I can communicate with. And it's an enormous responsibility, because first of all, you have to verify it. And you have to verify whether this is true or not, and it's very difficult often. And second of all, she is really risking her life and the life of her family, because she was sending her own children, they're adults, and they're like, go towards this direction, and tell me what you see. So I kind of had my own informants, you can say. And I'm communicating this, and at the same time, and this was a time when I guess a lot of Arab regimes had not discovered social media. Of course, in a while they would jump in completely. so the responsibility really was bridging that gap between these people and between Western journalists. And you mentioned before when you were having a conversation with Zainab that activism and journalism kind of blend in certain contexts. And that was my impression, because a lot of my comrades at the time were journalists. They were like Arab journalists who were living somewhere in the Arab world, and they became activists because to be a journalist, really, that's what it takes. If you want to be an independent journalist in such an environment, you have to push against power and really put your safety on the line. So I remember really discovering a difference in ethic between Western journalists, I'm sorry to say, and Arab journalists at the time. Because Arab journalists were really, they really understood the importance and the weight and the historical opportunity, what they're witnessing. Meanwhile, I mean, for example, I remember a case where I got a report from Libya. This was February 25th. I remember the day very well. And it was from Tripoli. And she's telling me that there are killings in the street because there was a protest, the last protest before it became completely civil war. And she's like, there are people dying under my building. And I can see them bringing in people, basically dark-skinned people. We don't know whether these are Libyans or he's basically bringing in mercenaries. And she's like, there's a lot of incitement against anyone who doesn't look Libyan, journalists, etc. And I need to reach out to someone. So I get in touch with BBC Radio. And I'm following with her almost every 5 minutes. I'm like, did you put it out? Did you put it out? And eventually it goes dark. I can't contact anyone. And then someone comes online. She's like, Anna, I left a post-it note. And I understood, for them, this is a career. And it was very stark because it taught me something. It taught me that, there are some journalists who understand, and there are journalists who don't.
It's a fascinating insight. I mean, to us, I think we watched what was going on and wondered if we would ever see the same kind of uprisings in South Africa. And I think it'd be good to pick up a little bit later on your point about journalists, not versus activists, but journalists and activists, and how you deal with that. But you use the phrase pushing against power, and Raphael, that's very much a role that you're playing in Angola, exposing corruption. Just talking to you backstage, a lot of similarities with South Africa in terms of the involvement of the president's family, Bell Pottinger, which you explained. Do you want to just talk us through what you've been doing in the last couple of years and where it's taking Angolan society, not just yourself?
When I started, I started investigating corruption deeply for one basic mistake. Once I went to an office, a public office, just to look for a record. And then I realized I saw at least 10 names of government officials who had companies. And I knew the companies, and I said, well, but how can they have their names here? And then be managers of these companies while holding public office. And I was doing a master's degree. And it was about corruption in Angola. And then for 4 months, I sat in that office like a crazy man, just going through records. And I was usually very quiet and took pictures of the staff and offered them the pictures and brought in some food. And by the time I was done with my master's, I just had this database on government officials, public servants, who were basically self-dealing, using their positions to enrich their companies and their relatives. And of course there was no media outlet for me to use as a vehicle to expose corruption and to investigate. And I had to create a website, a blog. But I didn't have the means to do that. And the irony is that one day I went to the beach with a Brazilian IT guy who worked for the propaganda for the regime. And then he was telling me how sad it was for him to do that kind of job, Then I said, well, you can repent yourself by designing a website for me. And that's exactly what he did. And for a year, essentially, the contents of the exposés I would do on the government would be uploaded from the same place they were doing propaganda for the government. And that was a revelation to me. I said, wow, wonderful, because they could never. And there were attacks against the website because it was very simple. But I think one of the articles I wrote, like a 10-page expose, and I said, well, people will have patience to read it. And online, only 2,000 people read it, but it was the beginning of a number of cases against government officials in Portugal, because those companies were linked to Portugal. And then I said, well, and that's where the activism part comes. Because when you expose, when you work in an environment where there is no free press, the first concern, if you want to be an independent journalist, is to fight for that space. There is no way around, you know. And in fighting for that space, you become an activist. So it's not unethical, it's just the circumstances in which you don't have freedom of press for granted. You have to fight for it. You have to conquer it. And that's basically what I did. And then I went to Portugal to launch this report, which was just basically an expose. And I said, well, people will not read it, but if I do it from Portugal, and then I leaked it to my colleagues, because I also learned something from spin doctors. I leaked it to a newspaper. And then, of course, everyone read what was in the Portuguese newspaper. And some investigations started. And just to give you an idea, some of these cases start 2009, 2010, 11, have reached the court this year. And the former vice president of Angola was on trial in Portugal. And the main reason why he ended up being charged with corruption was because he bribed the public prosecutor in Portugal to basically get rid of the case that I had started. So he was not caught for my expose, but for trying to get rid of the expose. But in one or another way, it works. So one really has to find creative ways to deal with corruption. And why was I so adamant in exposing corruption? Because at a time, those in power and their families basically just plundered the country with abandon. There was no distinction between public and private. You know. And I'm glad that the new president who's come in is now prosecuting some of these individuals. But for years, I was the one being prosecuted, and I'm still being prosecuted for exposing corruption. In 2016, I denounced how the then Attorney General had bought 3 acres of land in a very corrupt manner. And it was corrupt because, one, there had to be an edict on the piece of land he acquired for 30 days for people to claim, to have claims on it. And the edict only lasted 13 days until he got the title deed. And the peasants were removed from the land and were not compensated. Anyway, I was prosecuted for defamation. And when I was interrogated, I presented the title deed. I said, how is this defamation if I'm working with an official document? And I sent questions to the Attorney General's office. And here is the copy that they stamped that they received my questions. Because they always thought I was just joking, but I always kept records of all those questions, and I had them stamped, and I went through the bureaucracy. But to cut it short, when I presented the evidence, then the Attorney General changed the charges to crimes against state security. And now I'm on trial for crimes against state security because I denounced the plot of land. And then on trial, the judge says, well, I don't want anything political here last week. We're just here to talk about the land. And my question was, yes, Your Honor, but how am I on trial for a plot of land? What does it have to do with state security? And she says, I don't want politics here. I said, but how do I defend myself? You know, so I'm still thinking about it. How do I defend myself?
But Raphael, how does it affect your commitment to do more of this, right? I mean, you start off as a researcher, you set up a website, it begins to get into the mainstream media. You get charged with defamation and then crimes against the state. Has this increased your desire and your commitment to carry on exposing the truth? Or does it make you think twice before you're going to do it again?
At some point, you get so pushed, you just get used to it. Like when I face the judge in court, I'm laughing and I know that the judge is the one who's not comfortable because I'm used to the routine. So you become a rebel. You know? And the more they press you, the more you hunt them and expose them and dig. What is also interesting, for instance, talking about social media, I gave this example of this landmark article that was only read by 2,000 people, but generated all these legal cases abroad. To date, some of my articles are read by just on some social media platforms by over 100,000 people per article. And at some point, the average was like 60,000 per article. And I don't publish every day. And then you realize that there is more and more people coming. And now that we're in a transition period from one president to another, I've realized that everyone falling from grace has suddenly discovered my usefulness you know, and wants to talk to me and share more details about others who have been involved in corruption as well, not just them. And then I embraced them. I said, you know, bring them to me.
It's interesting how these situations turn around. Krivani, I'm sure you can relate to that, right? You worked in an environment where the SABC was the apartheid broadcaster, then it became the public broadcaster. And then you faced a wave of attacks on editorial freedom from not just Hlaudi Motsoeneng, from what I can gather, but from a lot of gatekeepers that he put in place. Did that diminish your commitment to getting the truth out, or did it spur you on to do more?
I think it spurred me on to do more because you would remember that the Hlaudi Motsoeneng, as you rightly point out, wasn't the first example. There was the blacklist that originated actually at SAFM. We're a very naughty bunch, I think. So I had just started at SAFM when the blacklist was released, and I was getting my head around what it meant, where was it coming from, and you heard a whole lot of stories. And I also experienced self-censorship for the first time during the blacklisting time, because whilst there was no formal communication of the analysts you could and couldn't speak to, but people were starting to self-censor themselves about who they think would be the right people to speak to. And it came to a point where there was this, and you would remember if you're a listener on SAFM, it came to a point there was a select few of commentators that were regular commentators over and over again, and you almost, even before they would come onto the radio to discuss a topic, you could preempt what they were going to say because you were so used to their form of analysis and commentary. And that for me was the first blinker that went off, that something's not right at the public broadcaster. We can't be just imposing a select view to our listeners. And I had left the public broadcaster. I managed to get a gig at EWN and ENCA, and my time there gave me a new way of doing journalism. So when I came back, I thought it was full circle. I'm coming back to SAFM now as the executive producer, armed with more knowledge, armed with a new way of doing business. But when I got there, they didn't tell me in the interview panel that Cloudy had such a tight noose around them. Sometimes I wonder why they didn't. But anyway, when I got there on my first day of the job, here I hear about this man. He was, it's almost like this godlike. That's how some people referred to him, the powers that he had to make things happen, to make money fall from the sky, to make it rain, so to speak, as you know, the youth term. And I thought, who is this man? But I got a chance to meet him exactly a year after joining the SABC. Clearly, the things we were doing on SAFM wasn't pleasing him. We opened a range of viewpoints. We were really embracing social media and the kind of viewpoints that were coming in. And remember, these are viewpoints from the very people we serve. So these are not comments that we can afford to ignore. And the people that are writing in there are the people that are experiencing everyday South African life. So we need to actually reflect it in our shows. And then I was summoned to his office, where he didn't look me in the eye once, but he kept pointing his finger at me, and he kept making all of these instructions, but didn't allow me an opportunity to rebut. And never before had I been put in a situation like that. It was myself and my RSG colleague Futa Kricher, because we use the same open plan space, and we often discuss our stories and our lineups. Cloudy was very unhappy with the editors. He felt that we were interviewing too many people who were using the platform to say to speak their mind about the way the news was covered. But the whole point of the editors is to interrogate ourselves. We've also got to do some self-reflection as the media. How are stories covered? So, for example, if a certain media is owned by a certain faction, you've got to interrogate how the story is covered in order to educate your listener. And he wasn't happy with that and gave us a 24-hour deadline to remove the program. What had also happened that led to us speaking out was a midnight statements. You know, politicians really love these midnight statements and cabinet reshuffles, but Cloudy also did that. Mr. Motsoneng sent out a press statement at night. When we got to work, we realized we cannot cover violent protests. Why? Because the protesters were saying that the ANC weren't delivering on services. The ANC was corrupt. The ANC had let them down for more than 2 decades. And we thought, well, this is bizarre. And then my colleague in the editorial line talk, Tandeka Gubule Mbeki, she stood up and said, I'm not having any of this. She voiced her protestation on the record. She was supported by Futa and Suna. And then 3 days later, they were suspended. Busi Ntuli, who's the executive producer of Special Assignment, she came to me and she said, what is going on at SAFM and at radio? I explained to her, and we said, well, something needs to be done. And I said, Busi, our last show of the editors is this Sunday, and I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can defy that order and just leave the editors and let it go. And in no uncertain terms, I was told by Cloudy that I would lose my job, effective immediately, because there were more people who could do my job better and would listen to him. And if I was unhappy, then I, as you heard in Parliament, we take the door or the window. And we decided it's fine. We will then not approach the issue in the manner in which he approached it. Busi, Jacques Steenkamp, and myself got together, and we really went through all the issues facing our newsroom. And we wrote to Cloudy, and we wrote to the board, and we wrote to Jimmy Matthews, as well as our direct line reports. And we did not get a response. We did not even get a, we will try and speak to you in the future. We engaged with them. And remember, this email now was sent to 13 different people, okay? The only thing that happened was Jimmy Matthews resigned, and suddenly we are being served with dismissal letters for speaking to the media, saying that we are now sending our letter. And by the way, Sudeshan Reddy sitting in the audience, I'm sorry if I embarrass you, but Sudeshan was one of our key editors of the letter that we authored. So we will always, the SABC 8 will always be indebted to you. and nobody responded to us, but we were faced with dismissal letters. It was a very scary a time in our lives. It's not, our lives weren't directly at risk the way your lives were, but it was very scary in that we were very alone. None of our colleagues actually stood up to support us because they knew how Mr. Motsoeneng worked. They knew the threats that he would, just spew out at any given time. People's jobs were on the line, and they weren't actually going to stand up now with, we were now named the troublemakers. And incidentally, it was social media that gave us the name the SABC 8. People think that we constituted ourselves and called ourselves the SABC 8, but it was actually social media. And we're all different individuals. None of us were actually even shared a personal friendship until that moment that we were thrust together. And at one point, the 7 people in the SABC 8 were the only people that actually talked to me at work. And they were very worried about how I was editing scripts, what I was doing. I had full support from my team at SAFM, which I'm always grateful for. But in terms of other people in the building, they literally would walk on the opposite side if they saw us coming. Nobody would share a cup of coffee with us because they didn't know what our so-called agenda was. Then we were told that the DA was supporting our campaign, or the EFF was supporting our campaign. That's how we became the SABC 8. It was a very lonely time. And then when Parliament said, we sought legal assistance, and one of the things that our lawyers did as soon as we sought assistance was go through all our mobile devices, our gadgets, and every single one of them had spyware. So now we had to then find different ways of communicating our legal strategy and how we're going to approach Parliament to do something about this, because the Portfolio Committee in Parliament actually believed all the lies that the former board had fed them. And that in itself was the biggest problem. So we were fighting this, we felt, this really big giant machine. But we had such a fantastic legal team. They came to our aid pro bono, taught us how to communicate where we don't have to actually rely on our laptops and our cell phones. We put together a really solid case and headed to Parliament. They couldn't hear from all of us, so Parliament suggested perhaps get the people who have been directly affected to speak. So we chose ourselves and we went to Parliament. As we were approaching Parliament, one of my colleagues got a message saying, "We know you're going to Parliament, you have one last chance to turn back," because by this stage, some of my colleagues had already been receiving death threats, and I didn't receive any, it was selected who, would receive these messages. And I got to Parliament, and when we got that message, I suddenly started to become very nervous, almost, feeling like I can't do this now. I'm very nervous. For the first time in 10 months, I started actually thinking of my family, because now I'm going to be going onto television. People are going to, because on radio, people have no idea what we look like. So now we're going to be going onto television. People are going to start to recognize us. What am I doing to my family? And I phoned my dad, and he said, "You've got to do what you've got to do. Just go ahead and do it. Do not worry about us. We're the adults. We're going to look after ourselves." And when I got to Parliament and I started speaking out for the first time in my life, and this really was my first time speaking out. My mom says I was a very willful child, so I've spoken out a lot before, but this was my really first time speaking out against power and against authority. And when I got to Parliament, there was this overwhelming sense of confidence that just waved over, and I realized what we're doing is the right thing. We're on the right side, and there's no need to fear. And when you're on the right side, there's something in you that just clicks, and you realize you're doing this not for yourself. You're actually doing it for the people that are going to come after you. You're doing it for the people that are here. You're doing it for your countrymen, and that was for me the biggest motivating factor to go and sit where I sat and say what I said. And things, obviously, we were trolled, We were called the SABC 8. Is that a new television station? As a journalist, you've always got to keep your phone on. You can't afford to put it on silent, for breaking stories. So my phone was always on, and every time I was trolled, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see all of these things. And for me, the biggest turning point came at the loss of our colleague Suna Fenter. That her death kind of, I don't think any of us have completely dealt with it. As much as we weren't personal friends with Suna, the fact that we had shared such a close space for this time, for this year, and then having to lose her, it still is a bitter pill to swallow. Like I said, we weren't all friends. We didn't. We often had great arguments and lots of fights about our strategy. And we weren't buddy that would just chat all to all late at night on WhatsApp and things like that. But losing Suna added a different dynamic to the group, and we realized now more than ever, whenever there's a time to do the right thing, I mean, there's no right time to do the right thing. There's always the time to speak out. I am currently grappling with the decision of activism versus journalism, because the job that I have is quite intensive, and then you have people walk in and want to vent, and then you kind of now don't know what to do, because 8 people have gone up and stood up, and what that has done, it's made another 1,000 people in the office a little bit more confident to stand up about what's happening in all 9 provinces. And you become now the de facto person, the go-to person, because you seem to have yielded results. Maybe if I come back to you, you will yield some more results. And it makes it a really difficult space, because you want to make this big public broadcaster such a success, but you also have a job to do as a journalist every day. So I'm still grappling with issues. And when I listen to you guys, I mean, I'm just in awe to be able to share this platform with you. My experience does not even come anywhere close to what you guys have had to do. But listening to you guys actually motivates me to continue to keep a bigger eye on what's happening at the public broadcaster.
Thanks, Kribani. Just a very quick answer, if you can. You spoke about self-censorship. You spoke about the fact that intimidation by management made some of your colleagues ostracize you. How did you deal with it then, and what are you doing about it now? How do you make sure that'll never happen again?
It's very difficult to ensure that it never happens again, because remember, when we were in Parliament, we talked about the so-called enforcers. Whilst a lot of the key decision makers are no longer there, Mr. Motsoneng, Mr. Aguma, members of the board, remember, they've also appointed people and remain at the SABC. But here's the conundrum. Have those people really repented? Are they really the people to take the SABC down, to be part of this new dawn, so to speak? Or are they still doing someone's bidding? So there's a deficit trust that currently exists. So it makes doing work a little harder, because you're always now wondering, when a decision comes and it comes from the top, where does it, when some of the so-called enforcers, what's in it for them? Or are they really repenting? Or have they changed? Because I always believe in second chances. I too have been given second chances. So I don't believe that it's my job to judge other people, but I'm always I've become very wary, to a certain point, I think a little bit paranoid about people's agendas. But the nice thing about the people that used to ostracize us, they now greet us, and they now talk to us, and they now also email us problems that they had. So that's a little bit different. But when during the time of the so-called loneliness, and you know how you felt and how you treated, you always, when somebody has changed a new leaf, you welcome it, but you always have almost a third eye watching. Yeah.
Thanks. Khadija, you edit a newspaper that has a very proud history of exposing corruption, whether it's political or business or other forms. What's it like on a Friday morning when the paper hits the street, do you get those bully boy phone calls? Do you get people harassing you? And what form does it take? Because I think often as readers, we don't think about the consequences for yourself and your journalists of what they're putting out there. If you could just grab the mic.
So I'll take you through something that happened yesterday, actually. So I'm the editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian, but I'm also a co-founder of a platform called the Daily Vox. And the Daily Vox published an interview with actually an activist that's here with the Oslo Freedom Forum, an Egyptian activist who speaks about the issues and really the harassment and persecution of homosexual people in Egypt. And the way that this this piece is written, it's basically this particular activist's own voice, right through. It's what the Daily Vox calls an as told to. So it's just this person's voice with a short introduction, giving context to what he's saying. And this was published sometime last week. So yesterday at some point I checked my phone after a very busy day and I noticed something like 12 missed calls from one particular number in Pretoria. So I made the mistake rather of calling back. And it was the Egyptian embassy. So the particular person who deals with with the media, he's quite new in South Africa, and the reason I know him is because he paid a visit to our office a few months ago, under in the guise of introducing himself and also bringing gifts. Very nice gifts, actually. We auctioned them off. And also offering us trips to Egypt, as many as we want. So he's someone, obviously, that I'm now familiar with. And his assistant puts me through to him, and he starts off asking after me how I am. It's been a long time. You'd swear we were good friends. And then he then says he's very perplexed by this story that that the Daily Vox published, and at first I wasn't even sure what he was talking about because this was published last week, like I said, and it took me a few moments to actually remember what exactly he could be taking issue with. And he starts off by saying something like, "So I'm just a brother calling my Muslim sister. I want to know, what do you think about this man and what he's saying? Do you really stand for this?" And that's his opening salvo, right? By the end of that conversation, I was so impatient with him. I pointed out to him that we live in a democracy in South Africa, that if he believes that in any way his government is being treated unfairly or has been reflected inaccurately, there are processes for him to follow through the press council, etc., which he can then do. And at that point, because I'd kept my calm throughout, but I mean, after 20 minutes of listening to absolute rubbish, I've also, sort of got a ceiling. But I took great pride, actually, in being able to point out to him that this is South Africa. We are a democracy. The freedom of the press is protected by our constitution, and there are institutions which you can go to if you feel we've treated you unfairly. So that that gives me, as an editor, it gives me a sense of comfort to know that I have these, I have these things to fall back on. But at the same time, this entire conversation also gave me quite, a moment to pause last night, because it really made clear to me how quickly and how insidiously, really, we can become embedded within, among power players. How an innocuous visit to the office, a coffee here and there, a gift, a trip to Egypt, and coming back to the Egyptian embassy again, they've been really good actually at taking a select number of of South African journalists to Egypt. And he keeps pointing out to me, why don't you ask such and such person who went to it on the trip last year? There's nothing wrong in Egypt. Everything is beautiful. Nothing at all wrong. Nothing at all. It's just like South Africa. So this, I mean, in many ways, you could say that this is an extreme example, but it's those same kinds of relationships that also pose a great danger to our everyday journalism as well, because when journalists become embedded within elites, which happens all too frequently and all too easily and also often uncritically, we also lose sight of what we're meant to be doing. So the Egyptian phone call last night is just an example, of some of the feedback, I like to call, that we receive. But at the same time, I take great comfort as well, knowing that we have processes in South Africa, that will stand up for us, though it may be difficult for a while. And I think that the SABC example is proof of that. That listening to Krivani and listening to her talk about the loneliness of that experience, I'm almost surprised, because it felt like the whole country was with you, and it really does go to show that how it sometimes feels inside a situation and how it feels outside. So it's really, really important, I think, for us to be vigilant about threats to media freedom, but often in places like South Africa, threats to media freedom don't always come from powerful figures just dictating editorial lines to us. They come in more insidious forms, and it's really, really important for us to have honest conversations about what the media is doing.
I find it interesting that you haven't referred to corporate power at all. That when we talk about power and we talk about threats to media freedom, we think politicians, rightly so, right? I've been doing some research into the so-called PR industry in South Africa and comparisons to the US. In the US, there's 6,000 PR practitioners for every working journalist. And I've worked on assignments where you have a PR team of 20 to 25 people dealing with a particular issue. So you phone as a journalist, you're up against a team of 25 who are getting paid incredibly well, who fly you to Zanzibar, not to Egypt. They'll give you tickets to Sun City, they'll send you champagne, etc. Do you feel their presence? Is it not as ominous? Is it not so much an issue? Or do you think they're smarter at it than politicians are?
In many ways, I think they're getting smarter. And because I think one of the greatest threats to media freedom in South Africa really is the commercial peril we find ourselves in, and the fact that so many of our media institutions face economic ruin because of really global trends in media consumption. And PR companies, corporates are alive to this. And we're seeing the lines being blurred, often sometimes from within our own organizations, from among our own salespeople who need to make sales, and those sales ultimately pay our salaries, but who are facing, demands from advertisers, for example, to blur the line between what is advertising and what is news. And there was an interesting example in the Sunday Times this week of that, and perhaps we can talk about that a little bit more. But I think that the fact that media institutions in South Africa, and indeed globally, South Africa is not an anomaly here, face economic ruin. Let's just be clear about that. That, I think, is one of the greatest threats to media freedom. Yep.
Thanks, Khadija. Lots of food for thought there. We've got about just over half an hour for questions.
A comment has been raised by quite a few of the individuals on the panel about the influence of social media in journalism. And from what I've gathered, it's more of a positive feedback. But I wanted to find out whether you feel that it's become necessary to have global exposure on those platforms to introduce change, to affect change? Or, yeah, basically, is it necessary? Or is it just a product? Is it something that happens after the fact? With movements like Je suis Charlie and the Arab Springs, we only find out about them afterwards, even with your work as well. So how only now you're getting 100,000 reads on average. But before, when these things are actually happening, is social media effective in generating change at the time?
So should I take this? Well, let me confirm first that I understand you correctly. You're asking whether these social media platforms are effective in the moment rather than afterwards in spreading awareness. Well, it depends how obsessive you are about following, being on Twitter or being on Facebook. Of course, we have a unique situation right now because we have kind of a cartoon character in the White House. And that's kind of a really interesting situation because what he does completely overshadows anything that we want to raise awareness about. So, he can, we could be speaking about an issue and Trump tweets something and nobody is interested in what we have to say anymore. It's a complete media circus. However, when certain important events are happening, the kind of people who take online, the kind of people who are on Twitter every day as part of their job, are normally people who are journalists and activists, politicians. They tend to be more plugged into the news. So I would imagine our audience online would be more represented. And I think Raphael mentioned, for example, how he wrote a blog that only had 2,000 reads, but it affected serious change or serious, even legal repercussions. And I think it's because those 2,000 people who would be interested in what an anti-corruption activist, a long report, it would be someone who's well informed on the issue. And it would be a certain kind of person. So sometimes it takes time for the narrative itself to propagate and to reach, every, the average audience. The real threat with social media right now is I think it's maybe two main points. The first point is what Khadija mentioned, which is that social media kind of broke our public sphere. Because previously we kind of had one conversation on big quality national newspapers and media. And these platforms kind of coalesce so many different communities of society, or parties or whatever. So there was one conversation on one platform, or at least that's how it appeared. With social media, we had basically bubbles. Everyone is speaking only to people who already agree with them. And this is where it's important to actually have there are certain key people on social media who are kind of at the intersection of several bubbles. These are people who have worked very hard. I like to think that I'm one of them. I don't know how successful I've been, but I have a very diverse audience, and several audiences converge on me. Of course, that means that I'm an insult magnet. But it also means that if I tweet about an issue, I know that it's going to some big U.S. libertarian names. It's also going to some, Islamists. It's also going to some, a lot of Western journalists. It's going to, the activism community. But you have to be very skilled about how to manage the narrative, because you can easily lose control over it, because it's a battle. It's a battleground, really. The second risk, I think, is that. I had mentioned that in 2011, governments, the bad governments, authoritarian governments, had not really discovered social media because they hadn't caught up, and now they did. Now they know that it's a powerful tool, and now we have something what I call censorship 2.0, because previously, I mean, when the media space in a certain country was restricted to national broadcasters and newspapers on different platforms. If you're a dictator in that country, you can shut them down, you can buy them out, you can threaten journalists, etc. But now that we have global platforms, they're not going to be able to of course, sometimes they try, but there's a steep economic penalty for shutting down the internet in your country, or going after one of those big platforms. So they realized very quickly that the right way to do it is they have to go to a different model of hiding the truth, which is, frankly speaking, and to say it bluntly, filling the space with bullshit. Completely, they don't have to convince you of a falsehood. They simply have to make you doubt what the truth is. By presenting so many different, smokescreen and so many different versions of it, they simply have to confuse you. And in that confusion, you're simply not true. You're not sure what's true anymore. Of course, in authoritarian governments, like in the Arab world, it's even worse, because what they do is it's not only, for example, what the Russians do, where troll factories and spam accounts and bots and stuff like that, but the fact, and this is something which I found very painful for me personally, because I was arrested in a campaign to shut down Twitter activism, to shut down the public sphere, because there was an alternative public sphere. You see, the public sphere, normally we're talking about, city squares, we're talking about newspapers, etc. We didn't have that space, so the Arab public sphere shifted online. And all of those, there was really beautiful discussions going on up to 2013, even up to I would say a year ago. And it was so amazing to see so many different voices converging on one sphere. I mean, I wrote a piece about it. Unfortunately, it was a long form expose, but it was only published in Norwegian, unfortunately, never published in English. And I was talking about the Saudi public sphere. I'm talking about LGBT activists, secularists and atheists, as well as conservatives, as well as people who are promoting, for example, of course, the women's rights activists. And these all represented so many different voices. And of course, there was a lot of anger and a lot of trolling on both sides. But there was also, conversation. Atheists, for example, were a visible minority. LGBT activists were several accounts. And yes, sometimes they would insult each other. But for the most part, they talked. And that was kind of almost a Tahrir Square moment, because before Tahrir Square, before the revolutions, we kind of stuck to our own bubbles, and then everyone went down on the streets, and that's when we met each other. We started to talk and debate. Of course, again, some of those debates were very angry, but again, it was progress. So what they did now is that they emptied the public sphere in a different way. They went after certain figures, such as myself, because I realized, for example, that once I was arrested, it was out that I was arrested, so many people simply quit Twitter. They're like, okay, this is what's going to happen to us. If they catch him, what are they going to do to us? So people basically get intimidated. Some people simply get arrested. And that's how you completely, the whole conversation, basically, a silence falls over that public sphere. And the real dangerous thing is that I feel that the conversation, there's pause is hit on the conversation. And it can be paused for years. And when we come back 5 years later, the world is different. And the issues that we should be discussing is different. But we're stuck with a conversation that we stopped having 5 years ago. And that's what really scares me. That's what scares me about what's happening in Saudi Twitter or in Emirati Twitter, or Saudi. I mentioned Saudi Twitter particularly because it's actually the country with the highest penetration rate of Twitter in the world.
I'd like to add something. In countries where you have no freedom of speech, professional journalists, they end up by blogging and publishing on internet and social medias. That's what happened to us in Morocco in 2009 and 2010. Many independent newspapers were shut off by the regime. So the only left space was the social media. But at the same time, actually we were professional journalists. We needed to work and to earn our living with our job, with doing what we do, which was not possible on the social medias. I think that the activists, the social media activists and the journalists don't have the same role. The role can be very similar, but it's two different things. And the fact that newspapers were either shut off or both, or like we mustn't confuse independent and private press, medias, which is the case in Morocco. So now we have a situation where we have no more professional journalists, because the journalists, they just go and they work in PRs, or when they find a job, when they are not blacklisted, or they seek asylum somewhere. And the social media job is like, it lowered, in my opinion, the level of analysis, the quality of the information, because it's being fed, as he had said, with a lot of different things, and it's not always quality information that you get in the social media.
Giovanni, you want to respond to something that you just said, and then I've got 1, 2, 3 more hands. Turkmen, can you wait a little bit? Okay.
Mine is just a very quick response. Yes, there was a groundswell of support. We had massive support from civil society, particularly in the form of SOS and partners. I was only referring to, especially when we walked into the SABC during that time. So I don't at any point want to diminish the support, the public and civil society support that we had received. It was just, my personal feeling of being quite lonely at night at the time of our threats, and then in the building at the time of our court cases.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. A hand almost at the back.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Rapisi. I just want to, I'm better known to be behind the camera than in front of it, so I just want to have a few clarifications, very small ones. Quite often, media is regarded in the concept of freedom, and it is dislocated from democracy and from development, right from its early establishment, 1856. What I want to know is, why is that the case? Why is it that when we speak about media, we say media of freedom, and dislocate it from democracy, the rights of humans, and its developmental necessity? Small clarification again. It interested me to see that some of the African people are exiled in Europe. Does that mean that the conditions for democracy and for the freedom of the press are not frowned in the African context? Is Africa incapable of democracy within itself? To Angola, I just want to find out a small question. Is it better for somebody to have good corruption or bad dictatorship? In other words, is it better for an alcoholic to drink beer than petrol? Last question to SABC. When I listened to you, I'm the first one to condemn hegemonic political contingency. Nobody has it. No political party can come out and say, we own a particular concept. But can journalists say that they own hegemonic editorial contingency? Do you feel that you can be the only people who can then interpret things without others? Because I get a feeling that there is some kind of a messianic approach to editorial contingency.
Thanks, Rapisa. Raphael, I don't know if you want to answer that question. It was good corruption better than bad government? Dictatorship.
Okay, good corruption and bad dictatorship. Angola has a constitution, and which does not enshrine neither bad corruption or good corruption or dictatorship. So it's all about the rule of law. And I think as in South Africa, as my colleagues here in South Africa are talking about how the constitution protects their rights, the same must happen in Angola. And I'm glad that the new president started a process of having some of the very corrupt people charged with crimes for the looting of the state assets. And that's what I have been fighting for years. So it's not a question of having good or bad corruption. There is no such a thing. Corruption is a crime and must be dealt with as a crime. And when you speak of the media environment, I would like just to make a point that quite often we forget that exactly that constitutional precept that when we have freedom of expression, that cannot go isolated from democracy. Like Angola has a constitution that enshrines democracy, but it's not practiced. So we can't really, and that's why as journalists, for instance, in my case, I was never able to really detach it from the fight for democracy. Because how do you exercise freedom if the sources are not available to you, for instance? If you tell the truth and you go to jail, if you're prosecuted for that. And that is why it is important to create a space where the democracy takes hold, so that all can be protected by the Constitution. But in fact, you cannot separate freedom of press from democracy. You have democracy in South Africa. You have, to a certain extent, some freedom of press, or you can fight for it, in the case of Angola, you have to do both. And that's the struggle we've been having for many years. I worked for a newspaper. I started my career in the only daily newspaper in the country, which was state-owned. And I had to leave because one day, for instance, a politician punched my colleague. We published that my colleague had been punched by a politician. And we were forced to deny that the punch ever took place. You see? So the social media actually was a blessing in a sense that it enabled us, when the government controlled the newspaper, the printing. Just to give you an example, at some point in Angola, to print a private newspaper, it cost $1.50 per copy, just the printing. And it went up to $2, which was nearly impossible for journalists to sustain. And the state security bought all these private independent newspapers. So the only way to do it was through the social media, the internet. And finally, one colleague is also being charged with me, is on trial with me, for reposting, for publishing my expose in a newspaper. And the point is exactly for the government to try to isolate what is happening on social media that is critical to the few newspapers that still have survived on a weekly basis.
If I could just add something very quickly. Something that Zainab said and Raphael said, I think really needs to be taken into account. The fact that in unfree countries, journalists end up having to publish the truth on social media or by blogging, and they're not getting paid for it. So I think this is a point which is really important. These independent voices need to be financially supported, be it by private donations or by foundations. You have no idea how much of a difference this makes, because these are often the only people who are shining the light on these issues. And I just want to make a quick comment about the link between democracy and freedom of the press. These two are very much very related issues. They kind of lean on each other, because in order to have a democracy, you need a population that is going to decide. Citizenship basically is political agency. How can the people vote on issues if they're not informed about the issues? How can they vote about the issues if they're misinformed about the issues. So you can't actually have a functioning democracy without having a healthy public sphere, and this is actually one of the drivers of the decline and the problems in democracies around the world today.
Yeah, you spoke also about the African journalists who are in exile. Let me speak about Morocco. Most of the people I knew who were journalists between 2000 and, let's say, between 1997, the end of the reign of Hassan II, where we had the Moroccan Spring, the Moroccan media spring, let's say, and we could create two important independent newspapers. Both of them have been killed, shut off in the late 2009, 2010. But all these people now are in exile. They don't work anymore in Morocco. Those who work in Morocco, because we work as journalists in a very corrupt country, and I think that it is similar to many countries in Africa. Even our profession becomes a corrupt profession. Those who try to work with professionalism, they are either jailed or they have to go to exile. But you have another category of African journalists or African newspapers. In Morocco, for instance, you can rent a column in certain newspapers. I can rent a column and tell what I want about you. And tomorrow, if you pay more, you can rent it and insult me also during 1 week, as long as you pay. You can do that. There is people who open newspapers only to get advertisement money. These are real issues for African journalism. And you don't find quality journalism. We need to go to exile. But when we go to exile, we are very specialized in our countries. And in the West, no one wants to read, I think, no one will hire a journalist who will write daily about Angola. No Western newspaper, for instance, in France and England will write daily about Angola. So yeah, the main issue with journalism is the fact of there is no professional journalism. There will be no professional journalism in Africa as long as journalists don't earn their living.
Thanks. And Krivani, do you want to respond to Rapite's views on journalists being messiahs?
So as far as the SABC editorial policy is concerned, SABC journalists did not write it. It is a public document that's written in line with the South African Constitution. Public has a say in that document, so do staff of the SABC, and that includes the newsroom. But when that document is finally passed and becomes the document that we live by as far as the editorial policy is concerned, we live by it. That means what's written in there safeguards our newsroom. Not only that, it's in line with the Constitution. So there's a few things I want to say would happen and would threaten our livelihoods, our dissemination of information. That is, the Constitution guarantees media freedom. But what it doesn't guarantee is what it doesn't talk about is the pressures that come from politicians and business and multinational conglomerates. I'm currently working on a story where a very rich European company is just slating everything we've worked on, but they're not giving us concrete evidence. It's just spin. The public space, seemingly supports all of these freedoms, but it's in action. So part of our job in living this mandate is to ensure that even when words are spewed out and statements are written, we've got to interrogate it. Just because somebody wrote it and gave it to us does not make it the gospel truth. And in doing so, we safeguard ourselves from things like the protection of state information bill. That's another threat to our media freedom. We've got financial pressures that make our newsrooms smaller. That means journalists can't spend longer hours interrogating a story, often work on 2 stories a day. There's also a trust deficit that currently exists, and we are trying to build out of it. And the only way we can get through all of this is if we stick hat in hand with our editorial policy. If we live it, if we own it, I know you were talking about this hegemonic approach to the editorial policy, but we have to own it as SABC journalists, because if we own it and live it, then we can, day by day, start to deal with all the other possible threats against our profession.
Thanks, Krivani. There's a hand behind Rapidze. 1, 2, 3. And then, seeing as we're supposed to finish at 12, we'll have to wrap up then.
Good morning. My name is Sean Earl Harris. I'm a photojournalist, a freelancer. I've been in South Africa for 25 years as a freelancer. And the state of media freedom, and I would like to bring it home as into the local area of South Africa, is not as free as many would like to see it. The freedoms that we expect as not only freelancers but staff photographers and staff journalists has been eroded since the new dispensation came in. And I say that in the way of when one has to work in an environment, if it's not only in the communities or even the cities, of how to capture those images and write the text. We have seen over the time our freedoms being eroded by mis- or disinformation within the whole and greater society. Since '94, I don't believe that we've had a, let's call it a mbizo, where the media can address some of the points that we are facing. In this last couple of weeks, we've seen physical assaults on journalists, which has been captured. And understand one or two things. What you see there is only a microcosm of what is the bigger effect to many of the journalists, freelancers, and staff photographers out there working in the communities. And myself, this last 2 weeks, been assaulted severely. The young man pulled a gun to shoot me because I was taking a photograph of a building in downtown Johannesburg. But his boss man explains to him that you have to get that camera and delete the images. After 6 security was trying to relieve me of my camera, which was tied to my hand, a scuffle broke out, etc. He decided to pull his gun, and it wasn't the end of story. I'm still here, but I pressed charges. In this manner, and I say that, is the disinformation or non-understanding of press freedom in South Africa by the greater public. Majority out there understand that the photographer, journalist has to get permission to take a picture or even have an interview, let's say, in that manner. So what I'm saying here is that the press freedoms that many of us expect in South Africa are not really there. I wanted to look at, and this is one perhaps proposal to the Nelson Mandela Foundation, is to, in the future, hold a Imbizo in the same presence of this, a dialogue, where the local issues of press freedom, of journalists' safety, of how and the rights of journalists, and I call rights, I'm talking about all the rights of journalists and all rights of citizens, and how we can and are able to operate in the greater community. In the same presence of that, as my new direction in my career is dealing with copyright now. And I say that because of, again, under the press freedom and how and who owns those images or the copy text after it has been used by certain publications. There are certain laws in the greater community of copyright and the management of copyright of journalists' work, and who owns that. In certain countries, it's a different operation than it is here in South Africa. In South Africa, we have clause 21A, I believe, under the Copyright Act, where once we've taken the image, the rights stay with that publication, even though that publication can make many, many great sums from those images. Myself, as a freelancer, who has, at the moment, it is the largest copyright infringement in the world, and we have proof that the figures which have been published are just a smaller part of the greater problem that I face.
Sean, do you mind if I stop you there, just so we can get a response and a couple more questions? Khadija, can I ask you to try and deal with the...
I think that issues related to copyright, particularly for photojournalists in South Africa, is something that needs more scrutiny. And it needs, and I think that as an industry, we need to come together to ensure that we're treating our freelancers better. And I say this as an editor of the MNG, and as the editor of a publication rather that hasn't always treated freelancers very well either. And we do need, these are the most vulnerable people within our industry. And we need to ensure that there are ways in which freelancers, for example, are able to have their rights assured, and that they are also, within organizations, we have things like trade unions, etc., that are, doing a fair job of protecting the rights of journalists as employees. We need to have similar structures in place to ensure that our freelancers are similarly protected. On your point about the sort of like the everyday harassment, etc., that still takes place in the life of journalists, that's the reality, I think, and it's particularly a reality when we are trying to photograph police people, for example. And this was, this received quite a bit of attention a few years ago. And the Right to Know campaign, for example, has published a fantastic little booklet that they, that they ask us as journalists to actually print out and keep in our, in our notebooks, so to speak, which actually explains the law. Regarding photographing, police people, etc. But I think, your point is that a lack of knowledge of what the law says, particularly among the police, is dangerous, and it places the lives of journalists in danger as well. So we do have to do better, and there has to be, a concerted effort. It cannot be that every time there's just one incident that we come together and coalesce around that. But I think that the challenge that we have is to ensure that we have consistent activism around these issues in South Africa.
Thanks, Khadija. I've always argued with William that he needs to do a project on why people hate journalists so much. Maybe it's time. We've only got a few minutes left.
That's your doing, Chris.
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to take the new hands. Can I take the three that we already had up? We take all three questions, and then the panel can deal with them and then wrap up. Can we take yours, and then you in the middle?
Can I go? You got the mic. I got the mic. So, Mohammed Kaji, Executive Director of ASRI, formerly with Al Jazeera in management in Doha, Washington, and San Francisco. My question is directed at Iyad, but I'm sure Zainab might want to add in as well. Many of us in this room obviously believe that free speech is the lifeblood of democracy. But the question is there a double standard towards the democratization and freedom of speech in the Arab world or in authoritarian regimes? We've seen Mohammed bin Salman in Washington, D.C. recently, but similarly, the same freedoms that are extended to ourselves in South Africa or in the United States or in the Western world aren't similarly extended towards citizens within those countries. So is there a fundamental systemic problem here that will never actually bring liberty to the Arab world, which is essentially an elite relationship between the governments that will maintain authoritarian Islam for an extended period of time until that systemic problem is sorted. Because until then, we hamsters in a hamster wheel in civil society trying to change through money from foundations and so on. But do you feel that that power is just too strong for us to actually make that step forward? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Should we take a question there? I don't know if you need the mic.
How people on the ground have sort of raised their voices against the media. One example was Fees Must Fall. The students made it a point to say we don't want the media at certain instances. And after the whole thing, it was that the responsibility of the media in misrepresenting the students, you know. So what are the responsibilities of the media, you know, in terms of making sure that they are not attracting attacks towards themselves? The last one, I think, if I may, to Chris, is the issue of public relations within the public sphere. Are they legitimate players? Because in my head, I'm saying, if it's freedom, let the fake news publishers, let PR people get a similar play, just as media houses. Because if media houses are the purveyors of truth, then they should then necessarily balance out everything else. Because one of the problems I have, for instance, is that we talk about fake news. The media, the mainstream media, sometimes remove themselves from the problem. Take sources, for instance. We read article after article where the sources are not named. And yet, it feeds into the problem. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Chuck?
Yeah, I am Turkish journalist. Before I work in India and I covered Tamil war, Sri Lanka, and last 8 years I am here. And my newspaper was the biggest newspaper and shut down by the Turkish Erdogan before the coup because we exposed his corruption. And this corruption now started in the USA, $107 billion, maybe biggest in the century. So whatever. So Turkish ambassador, after the coup, Turkish ambassador accused me being of terrorist at the AM Live second account on this program. So my question is, after that, only my colleagues, South African colleagues, formed this program and said, this is our friends and he is not terrorist. And I said on the live program, this is our culture. I repeated 3 times. If I am a terrorist, South Africa must come and arrest me. If I am not terrorist, give my dignity back. And then I started my master's at UJ on human dignity, and I completed. So it means, first, what I understand, first we have a dignity, then we have a right. Not we have a first right, and then we have dignity. We are human beings, and all we have a right. Then I want to clear my name, and I call Dirko. Dirko says to me, Turkish embassy must clear your name. I said, how? They are the butcher. They want to destroy me. Then I call Foreign Correspondent Association, give me the media card. They said, we don't want to involve your issues. This is foreign issue. If it is foreign issue, why we belong to same family? You from the, it is actually very interesting. I communicate my Angola colleagues on Twitter. I communicate my Baghdadi without knowing. All this symbol, and I saw them here now. So then I go to Foreign Correspondent Association. I said, I am a journalist, I am a member of you, I am paying you and protect me. No. This is your personal issues. Then I go to local media institute. I am a member. They said no. Then I go to Human Rights Commission. It's a big South African Human Rights Commission. They said only we can bring your embassy and you together. I said no, I don't want, because last month they arrested my brother. He was a general surgeon, associate professor. He arrested me. He was supporting me financially because he transferred money to me. Then he arrested in Turkey. So my question is straight away.
And in South Africa also, I never ever received any single official statement supported me, no one. So I'm asking you, I joined the One IFRA World Editors Forum. And too many in the Europe also, too many you have UN and you have Amnesty and too many media institute. What are their roles, what they do and how they protect? They really functioning? Because I feel myself very defenseless and I got my visa and I am moving. I will move from here and I will go to Canada or somewhere because I have to save my life and my kids. So because activism is, there's a limit because there's the kids and there's things. So I want to ask, there's a colleagues here, what these really media institutes, what they really do. Diplomatic immunity, they protect diplomats, but who protect us? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know how we deal with that. I must be very honest. I think that we need a separate discussion about your situation. I don't think anybody here has answers for that. And maybe we can chat, William, afterwards about what can be done.
I can just suggest to contact certain international NGOs. When I personally was in a situation similar to yours a few years ago, I got some help. I got a safe place where I could stay, a stipend. I received help. So I can, if you want, at the end of this conference, give you one or two contacts. I hope they will help.
Have you contacted CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists? Because that's their mandate, that's their job. Their job is to protect journalists, and freelancers and bloggers are also considered journalists.
But these guys sometimes they do nothing. Like RSF, Reporters Without Borders in France, I know they don't help.
So to get to the answers, I think, how much time do we have? All right. Okay. So that I'll run through very quickly, and I think I'll just comment on the three questions and then pass it on to Zainab and Raphael. So you asked a question about whether the alliance between dictators and Western elites is threatening the media sphere. It absolutely is, of course. The glimmer of light over here, it has always been the case. The glimmer of light, I would say, is that our dictators no longer have a monopoly over the truth. Because of a lot of the most effective media platforms right now are international, they're global. We're talking social media networks and the internet. And this is where I don't think we should focus our activism on advocacy with governments, because unfortunately there is a lot of corruption there. They call it lobbying, I call it corruption. And sometimes in the case, it actually is corruption, it's not just legal lobbying. I think we should really focus our attention on improving our media game, managing our narratives better, and really ensconcing ourselves in civil society, because freedom of the press is that one issue that everyone who is a dissident will agree on. And even if you're not a dissident, you could become a dissident in any moment. I do want to comment very quickly on your question, because you mentioned, I think, how something about fake news and why don't we just let them publish. There is some, I find that troublesome, because if I go and buy a Pepsi, for example, and I find it to be a bottle of poison instead, someone cheated me. Those people who are publishing news have a responsibility towards their audience to tell the truth. And if they're not, they're failed. There's an unwritten contract over here between me and them that if they are giving me news, I expect it to be factual. So I think this is something that I think, I don't know how the law deals with it, because in different countries the legal code is different. But I think there is something there which is deeply troublesome about fake news, especially that they're sovereign. These are countries. They are state apparatus that's actually spreading this false news, and they're not democracies, And just a quick note about your situation. And of course, we completely sympathize, because a lot of our colleagues are in the same situation. Unfortunately, sometimes when you are not when you don't have a big account on social media, you don't have a lot of friends in NGOs, you're ignored. Unfortunately, that is the case. And I know, for example, there are many Iranian human rights activists who were exiled after the 2009 uprising in Iran, and they're all asylum seekers now in Turkey. They can barely make a living. They've all been, of course, they've been in jail, so they've been tortured. They're also traumatized. Some of them fall into substance abuse. Some of them, they simply commit suicide. It's really, really important for the community, and I would like you to stay in touch with us, because I really want to see how South African NGOs are going to deal with this, because if they don't, there's going to be hell to pay, let's say.
Yeah, very quickly. About the corruption, I've been speaking about my experience as a Moroccan journalist, but I'm also a French journalist, actually, and I am really interested about how the French media cover Morocco, and you discover really horrifying things. You discover that some French journalists who are specialized in Morocco, they are getting invited to the Mamounia, received in very luxury villas, and so those guys, they only write about the wonderful advancements in Morocco, which is not really the situation in my country. This exists in the West, and I think that there is also, I hate using that accusation, but I think that there is also a racist vision in the European, in the Western media towards Africa. They tend to tell you, you're better than in Syria. At least you are not killing each other. Oh, in your country, at least you eat. What's the problem? But guys, we want the same as you have in Europe. We want the same freedom, the same rights, the same everything. We don't deserve less. But I think that this speech is something that still unfortunately exists, in addition to the corruption issue. I would like also to answer your question about the Prophet. What's the situation of the Prophet Muhammad? I think things got very clear. If anyone draws him, he will get killed. This means that one can't have, from one hand, this very brutal limit of freedom of speech imposed by weapons. If you do it, I kill you. And on the other hand, people who continue to say, yeah, but doing it offends people. Actually, suppose that you have offended people on the one side. On the other side, you don't have offended people. You have people who were killed, executed by weapons. And for me, it means that it is our duty as journalists, first, to be very, very supportive of those who still have the courage to speak about those issues. And actually, no one knows. No one now in Europe or in the United States does, because everyone is afraid. And second point, as cartoonists, if we accept to stop our limit of creativity, if we accept not to draw the Prophet Muhammad, because actually the problem of the terrorists is not about cartooning him, it's about depicting him. You can't depict him, even in a positive way. So if we stop doing this, so we accept officially the concept of blasphemy in our work as journalists, as artists, as cartoonists. So why then drawing Jesus? Why Moses? Why the Pope? Why drawing every single thing that is sacred, that is holy for every single human being in this earth? I think our job is not to think about offending or not offending. As long as we respect the law of the countries where we work, it's our freedom, and not only our freedom, I should say. If we have colleagues who are killed because of that, it becomes our duty to keep doing it.
Thanks, Zineb. We've covered almost everything. Khadija, you are asked to respond to depiction of the Prophet as well. I don't know if you want to.
I'll get back. I'll go to that second, but I want to start off by I think your point about the fees must fall is really, really interesting, because there was a very interesting dynamic between student activists and journalists during the protests, right from the beginning, and it really devolved into all-out antagonism, which made the work of journalists near impossible. But I think that if we were to step out, and I know that several students have done research projects on Fees Must Fall and sort of like media coverage of it, and I haven't personally read any of those, so you would know better about what the proper analysis of this was. But I think that if we were to step out, you really have a microcosm, I think, of the trust deficit in media. When you look at that Fees Must Fall situation, and really when you step out and you look at it, and I say this as someone who was in some ways very much inside the Fees Must Fall sort of culture. I say this as someone who was running a publication that at first was trusted by the students and allowed access to certain events and to certain town halls where other media institutions were not allowed that same access. But we also noticed how quickly as well activists were able to turn against us. So in one case, for example, it was I think it was during a registration period, and one of our journalists took a picture of an activist putting up a poster, or no, actually it was him blockading an elevator at WITS. And so it was two of our journalists who had taken, one was reporting, one was taking pictures, and suddenly an entire group of students, numbering more than 50, surrounded our journalists and physically assaulted them. And this was knowing that these are journalists that are sympathetic to their cause. And when we reported on that altercation, it became clear to us also how quickly these kind of dynamics change, and how difficult it is to manage, and how difficult it is for us to ensure that trust and respect of the media is maintained, so that the media is not only your friend when they're reporting on you doing good things, that we have to report on you when you're up to shit. That's our job. And in order for you to trust us to tell your story when you're at the forefront of a worthy cause, you also have to trust us to tell the story when you're up to no good. And I think that really is a situation that mirrors itself throughout South African society, especially in government as well, right? And this deficit of trust, and it's not unusual in South Africa, but I think in many ways our dynamics are different. It really threatens the media freedom that we have. But it also, I think it threatens also how we are able to understand each other. So unless we're able, and I feel that we need to do a better job teaching media literacy, for example, at a high school level, where I find the understanding of the difference between an opinion piece and a piece of journalism is often not there. People don't understand, Chris's column to an investigative piece, right? People don't understand the difference, and that in many ways can become very, very dangerous. So I think, I'm not sure what the full extent of our response to this is, but I think that it has to begin really with better media literacy. But I think, and I think that it's also important for us as media professionals to always cast a light back on ourselves and try to understand why are we not trusted? If indeed we are doing this noble work of telling the truth, why then are people not trusting us? And this, I think, goes back to what I said earlier on, is that we become so embedded within elites in society that we are forfeiting our primary function of mirroring the realities of society. And that's not, that's not what's happening in Parkhurst. But it's actually understanding and being able to give a full picture of South Africa. And I think that we forfeit this responsibility too often. Sometimes, yes, it's because of a lack of resources. And I cannot underscore how an under-resourced newsroom is a threat to media freedom. It really, really is. But in other in other instances, it's laziness, or it's just routine, or it's just habit. Chris feeds me a story that's so easy, I can put it together in an hour. I'd rather do that than go out and protest somewhere in Diepsloot. I've got to get other shoes, and so there are a number, and I think that we also have to, and we do not have a stage in South Africa where we're able to have honest conversations about what the media does and how the media reports on issues without it devolving into some kind of mudslinging contest where journalists are either always evil or always good. And we need to be able to do that better, and I don't see us doing this well enough, that it's often, as soon as you see a journalist reporting on a politician that, that you formerly, I think last week's incident with Floyd Shivambu was very demonstrative of this. That here was a politician who assaulted a journalist. There was no other way of looking at it. He admitted to it, he's apologized for it. And yet, even on Sunday, I think Ranjani Munsami, who wrote about it in the Sunday Times, was still getting abuse on Twitter for writing about this, right? Because Floyd is now a darling of some people, it means that we're meant to ignore when he does something wrong. And therefore, it's, you see, you journalists, it's, X, Y, Z, I don't want to, go into that. So we also need to reach a stage, or we need to create a platform in which we're able to have conversations, in which we're able to engage journalists, because I don't think journalists have descended from heaven to save us. They're human beings, and they are prone to the same kinds of follies that any other person is. And we do need to have honest conversations. We need to be able to question journalists and ask what exactly went into that story and not that story. We do need to do this, but at the moment we certainly do not have I don't know whether it's the language really to do this. We seem not to yet have the language to do this properly.
Just want to add a comment, because this was very interesting for me about how journalists are viewed in South Africa, because I was really I was kind of obsessively interested in a similar phenomenon in Pakistan, where during the years after the Arab Spring, it was really interesting to see how in the Arab world many journalists were activists, and they were very highly respected among people, and we're fighting for free speech. Everyone was fighting for free speech, even people who I wouldn't necessarily like, but because everyone was fighting for this right. And I was comparing that with people who should be around, should have the same opinions as me, at least, if I talk about socioeconomic level in Pakistan, and I see that they actually are, very complacent on the question of free speech, and we can actually see that there are many people who are opposed to free speech, even though for us, free speech was a tool in our hand. It was the only power we had. And I understood later that for them, they viewed free speech as elite talk. They viewed journalists as simply representatives of the elite who were out there to push this narrative that the people of this country are not ready, they're savages, they're socially backward, on behalf of certain elites who were, basically profiting from this narrative. I think it's very important, if you want the common man to respect journalism and free speech, he has to feel that free speech is a tool for him. It is something on his side. And this is where it's really up to the journalist to actually, to actually campaign on behalf of the underprivileged, the people who don't get heard. Once they feel that this is the way we get heard, I think the relationship would change.
I couldn't think of a better way to end this conversation. I think it's sort of taken us full circle. Nkululeko, those were good questions. I thank the panel very much for being frank and honest. Thank the audience, thank the hosts. My only response to your statement is I think we should all know more about what the other side of journalism is doing, the PR people, the advertising people. Because as a communications consultant, I love the fact that newsrooms are smaller, journalists are lazy, journalists are corrupt, editors can be bought, stories can be written. But as a citizen, it scares the hell out of me, because everybody's doing it. And I think there needs to be a very detailed conversation about those power relationships and how they influence what you read, what you hear, and what you see. But thank you very much for coming. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too. And those who've traveled far, we wish you a good trip back. Those who got lost, we hope you go back to the right place. Thank you very much.